Hey everybody, I'm going to talk about how to graph a piecewise function. So piecewise function, kind of the name tells you what's going on. Piecewise function is going to have multiple pieces and together they make a function. So we're going to graph the following piecewise function, that is f of x. And what we're going to have is we have three rows here, so three lines. So I'm going to graph one piece, two piece, three pieces all on the same graph. I recommend going one piece at a time, so I'm not going to worry about the other piece here. I'm just going to worry about this top line, finish that, then worry about my second line, then worry about my third line. So for this top line, the piece that we're going to start with, it says negative 2x plus 4. And this is really, it says f of x here. That's like saying y equals negative 2x plus 4. So if I'm wanting to graph this, I'm going to lean on my calculator so I can, the graphing part's pretty easy. And I'm more worried about the actual piecewise, what makes this a piecewise function is going to be where my focus is at. So to easily graph this, I'm going to start by going to y equals on the calculator, and I'm just going to type in negative 2x plus 4. And you could always graph that, and it will show up. Here's where the piecewise function comes in. So back in Algebra 1, we would take this entire graph and transfer it over to my paper. In fact, we could use the table of values to do that, which to get there, we're going to hit second table. And we could use these table of values and plot all these points, meaning every single row here is a point. So like I have the point 1, 2, 2, 0, etc., etc. But here's where the inequality comes in. This says x is less than or equal to negative 1. What that means is when I go through my table, I only want the x values that are less than or equal to negative 1. So I don't need to plot these positive points like 1, 2, 2, 0, 3, negative 2. Those are x values that are greater than 0. So I want greater than negative 1. So I need the x values greater than or equal to negative 1. So I'm going to start by plotting a point such as starting at negative 1. So this has negative 1, 6. So I'm going to start there. Negative 1, 6, lightly put a point. I'm going to go to the next one. It says negative 2, 8. So I'm going to go negative 2 all the way up to 8, lightly put a point. I could go to negative 3, 10. Left 3, up 10. I could go to negative 4, 12. But you'll notice if I go left 4 and then up 12, I'm off the graph. So there really isn't a strong need to plot that point. Okay? So that's the first part of this. The second part of the inequality is really the inequality in itself. You'll remember back in Algebra 1 when we were graphing inequalities on number lines, we had to really pay attention to what inequalities we were using. When we used inequalities such as less than or greater than, we would use open circles. When we use less than or equal to or greater than or equal to, we used points that were filled in. So if you notice, this is saying x is less than or equal to negative 1. That means when x is negative 1, which x is negative 1, y is 6. When x is negative 1, because of the inequality, I need a filled in circle here. Okay? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a game of essentially connect the dots. So my graph is going to come up and to the left to these other dots. And when I get to this other point, this isn't an endpoint. Remember, I could have kept graphing if I wanted to. So to represent that, I'm just going to represent it by an arrow. What I've done is I have essentially graphed that first line. Okay? Quick review, just type it into y equals. Only pay attention into the table for the x values it tells you is important. So this said all the x values that are less than or equal to negative 1. So those are the only x values I graphed. So when I move on to my second piece of my piecewise function, it's just y equals negative 3. So I'm going to go back to my equation, clear out my old one, type in negative 3. And I can graph that to take a look at it. And I could go to my table. But instead of plotting all of the points in here, up and down, I wanted to pay attention to a certain few or a certain piece. This inequality says negative 1 is less than x, which is less than or equal to positive 3. So what this is saying in basic words is I need the x values from negative 1 to positive 3. So in my list, I'm only going to plot the points that have x values from negative 1 all the way up to 3. So at negative 1, I need to be at -1, -3, which is down here. The next one would be 0, -3, so 0, -3. 1, -3, 2, -3, and 3, -3. Because again, I only need the x values from -1 to +3. So I don't have to worry about the -2s, the -3s, the -4s. I don't have to worry about the points beyond 3, like the 4s, the 5s, the 6s. Okay? Final thing I need to worry about is open and closed circles. So when x is -1, looking at this inequality, and back to algebra 1, I need to have an open circle when my x value is at -1. So this point down here represents -1, -3. My x value is -1, but I need an open circle there. On the other end, I have a 3 here, which means when x is 3, we're at -3. This point, and because of the inequality, I need a filled-in circle. The only thing left to do is just connect the dots. So in between, you're going to go through and connect the dots there. And that is my second piece that I have graphed. Finally, the third piece is this bottom equation. It's y equals x minus 3. So I'm going to go back to y equals, clear out what I have. X minus 3. I can graph it. And now we have to pay attention to what piece of the table I need. This says x is greater than 3. Or I need all the x values that are greater than 3. So I'm going to start at when x is 3. And I'm going to worry about numbers like when x is 4, 5, 6, 7, etc., etc. I want the numbers 3 on up. Including the 3 will be important. You'll see here in a second. So using my graph when x is, or my calculator, when x is 3, my y should be at 0. So there's 3, 0. The next point is 4, 1. So over 4, up 1. The next point is 5, 2. Over 5, up 2. The next point is 6, 3. Over 6, up 3. Next point, 7, 4. And you're going to start seeing the trend of the graph. Now, it wanted all x values greater than 3, so I could have continued this trend on forever and ever and ever. I don't need to once I reach the end of the graph. We'll deal with that here in a second. But when x is 3, and following what I knew from algebra 1, when we have less than or greater than, we use an open circle. So when x is 3, the point that is connected to x being 3 needs to have an open circle. So this was the point 3, 0. That's where my open circle is going to be. And then I'm going to connect the dots. And remember how I said this continues on forever and ever to the right? To represent that, we're just going to put an arrow. So that was a basic problem involving graphing piecewise function. Hope it helps.